The domestication mystery. Why humans tamed. So few, okay. Picture this for a second. There are over 8 million species of animals on this planet. 8 million. And out of all of those, guess how many we've actually managed to domesticate? Like, truly turn into partners that live alongside us? 14. Just 14 mammals. That's it. I'm not talking about taming here. I mean, the circus lion that still wants to eat your face isn't domesticated, it's just scared of the whip. I'm talking about real domestication. The kind where a wolf becomes a golden retriever, where a wild boar becomes a pig that literally can't survive without us. And here's where it gets absolutely wild. It's not like we haven't tried with other animals. Oh, we've tried. The ancient Egyptians had armies of cheetahs. Swedish kings tried to create moose cavalry units. Yes, you heard that right. Moose cavalry. We've spent thousands of years attempting to domesticate zebras, and you know what? They still bite harder than a crocodile and refuse to let go. But why? Why can your neighbor have a purring cat on their lap? But nobody, and I mean nobody, has ever successfully domesticated a zebra despite them looking exactly like horses? Why do we have 30 breeds of dogs but not a single domesticated bear? What you're about to learn will completely change how you see every pet, every farm animal, even every pigeon on the street. Because the truth is, there's something almost impossibly rare happening in these animals' DNA, something that 99.99998% of all species simply cannot do, no matter how hard we try. And once you understand what that is, well, let's just say you'll never look at your dog the same way again. So let's dive into the actual numbers here, because when you really understand the scale of what we're talking about, it becomes almost unbelievable that our entire civilization is built on such a tiny fraction of the animal kingdom. Scientists have been trying to count every species on Earth for centuries, and the most recent estimates put the total number at around 8.7 million species. Now that includes everything. Insects, plants, fungi, all of it. But let's just focus on mammals for a second, because that's where most of our domestic animals come from. There are somewhere between 6,000 and 6,600 mammal species on this planet. 6,000 different types of furry, milk-producing creatures that could theoretically become our companions or livestock. And out of those 6,000, we've managed to truly domesticate exactly 14. Dogs, cats, cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, horses, donkeys, llamas, alpacas, camels, yaks, rabbits, and guinea pigs. That's the list. The whole list. Now you might be thinking, wait, what about chickens? What about ducks? Well, yeah, if we include birds, the number goes up to about 42 total domesticated animals. But here's the thing, that's still absolutely nothing compared to the millions of species out there. We're talking about 0.0002% of mammalian species. Try to wrap your head around that for a second. If all mammal species were people in a small city of 6,000, only one single person would represent all our domesticated animals. But here's where the story gets even crazier. Let me paint you a picture of what domestication has actually done to our planet. If you could somehow weigh all the mammals on Earth right now, every single one, you'd find something that would blow your mind. Livestock, our domesticated farm animals, make up 60% of all mammalian biomass on the planet. 60%? Wild mammals? All the lions, tigers, bears, elephants, whales, everything you see on nature documentaries, they make up just 4%. 4%? And humans? We're 36%. Think about that. Your dog, your cat, the cows at the farm down the road. They're part of a group that weighs 15 times more than all wild mammals combined. Every elephant in Africa, every wolf in the wilderness, every whale in the ocean. Add them all up, and they still weigh less than our pigs alone. Actually, let me give you some specific comparisons that'll really mess with your head. All the domestic dogs in the world, from Chihuahuas to Great Danes, collectively weigh about the same as all wild land mammals put together. Just dogs and house cats, they outweigh all African elephants by nearly 2 to 1. Those little furballs that knock things off your counter have twice the collective weight of the largest land animals on Earth. This is what 8,000 years of domestication has done. We've essentially replaced the wild world with a handful of species that we've bent to our will. And when I say handful, I mean it literally. You could count our major domesticated animals on your fingers and toes. Now you might wonder, okay, but surely we're still domesticating new animals, right? With all our modern technology and understanding of genetics, we must be adding to that list? Nope. The last major animal we domesticated was the rabbit, and that was during the Middle Ages, around 600 years ago. Before that, it was the guinea pig about 3,000 years ago in South America. Every other domestic animal, your dog, your cat, the chickens laying your breakfast eggs, they were all domesticated in prehistoric times before we even invented writing. The dog was first, somewhere between 15,000 and 40,000 years ago, depending on which scientist you ask. Then came sheep, pigs, and goats around 11,000 years ago. Cattle showed up about 10,000 years ago. Horses were domesticated 6,000 years ago. And that was basically it for the big important ones. Since then, despite having developed space travel, computers, and genetic engineering, we haven't added a single large mammal to our domestic roster. Not one. The Soviet Union tried for decades to domesticate moose. Failed. Africa has millions of zebras that look exactly like horses. Still wild. There are over 400 species of antelope. We've domesticated 0 of them. And this isn't just about mammals. Of the approximately 10,000 bird species on Earth, we've domesticated about 40. Out of 34,000 known fish species, we've truly domesticated maybe 30, and most of those are just goldfish varieties. Insects. Over 1 million species identified, and we've domesticated exactly 2, the honeybee and the silkworm. Here's another way to think about it. Imagine if aliens visited Earth and wanted to catalog our relationship with animals. They'd find that 96% of all mammal biomass on the planet consists of humans and our domesticated animals. The entire wild world, everything from mice to moose, makes up just that tiny 4% sliver. In some countries, this ratio is even more extreme. In Britain, for example, domestic animals outweigh wild ones by about 1,000 to 1. 1,000 to 1. For every pound of wild deer or badger in the British countryside, there are 1,000 pounds of sheep, cattle, and pigs. The United States alone has about 94 million cattle. That's 1 cow for every 3.5 people. There are about 9 billion chickens in the United States at any given moment. That's 27 chickens for every single American. Globally, we slaughter about 74 billion chickens per year. That's 10 chickens for every human on Earth, every single year. Yet all of this complete transformation of Earth's mammalian biomass, this replacement of the wild with the domestic, comes from just those 14 mammal species I mentioned earlier. We've taken 14 types of animals and multiplied them so successfully that they've essentially conquered the planet, at least in terms of sheer weight and numbers. But here's the question that should be burning in your mind right now. Why just 14? With 6,000 mammal species to choose from, why did we stop at 14? It's not like we only encountered 14 species. Humans have spread to every continent, every environment. We've encountered thousands upon thousands of different animals. We've tried to domesticate hundreds of them. So what makes a dog different from a wolf? What makes a cow different from a buffalo? What invisible line separates the 14 mammals we've domesticated from the 5,986 we haven't? The answer to that question is way stranger and way more specific than you might think. Because it turns out domestication isn't just about training or taming or even selective breeding. It's about something much deeper, something coded into the very DNA of these animals, something that most species simply don't have and can never develop, no matter how hard we try. All right, so before we go any deeper into why some animals can be domesticated and others can't, we need to clear up probably the biggest misconception people have about this whole topic. And I mean, this confusion is everywhere. You've probably made this mistake yourself without even knowing it. Most people think taming and domestication are the same thing. They see a circus elephant standing on a ball and think, oh look, a domesticated elephant. They visit someone with a pet raccoon and say, wow, you domesticated a raccoon. Nope, not even close. These animals are tamed, not domesticated, and the difference between those two words is absolutely massive. Let me break this down in the simplest way possible. Taming is something you do to an individual animal. Domestication is something that happens to an entire species over many generations. Taming is behavioral. Domestication is genetic. Taming is temporary. Domestication is forever. Think of it this way. You can take a wolf pup, raise it from birth, bottle feed it, sleep with it, spend every waking moment with it, and you might end up with a somewhat tame wolf. It might tolerate you. It might even show you affection. But its puppies? They'll be born just as wild as any wolf in the forest. You'd have to start the entire taming process from scratch with each new generation. Now take a dog. You can take a golden retriever puppy, never train it a day in its life, barely interact with it, and it will still naturally want to be around humans. It will still wag its tail when it sees you. It will still follow your pointing finger, something wolves can't even understand without extensive training. That's because dogs are genetically programmed to live with humans. It's literally written in their DNA. Let me give you the perfect example that really drives this home. Asian elephants. These magnificent creatures have been working alongside humans for 4,500 years. They've built our temples, fought in our wars, carried our kings. In Thailand and India, they're such an integral part of the culture that most people assume they're domesticated. They're not. Not even a little bit. Every single working elephant you've ever seen is genetically identical to its wild cousins. When a captive elephant has a baby, that baby is born completely wild. It has to be captured, confined, and trained through a brutal process called the crush, or breaking, where the young elephant's spirit is essentially broken through restraint and punishment until it submits to human control. This is completely different from what happens with a baby horse. A foal is born already inclined to accept humans. Sure, it needs training to be ridden, but it doesn't need to be broken psychologically. It's already genetically prepared for a relationship with humans. Here's another mind-blowing example. Those tigers you see in Las Vegas shows or circus acts, every single one had to be hand-raised from cubs, trained intensively every day of their lives, and even then, they're one bad mood away from reverting to pure predator mode. But if you take a house cat that's never seen a human before, a truly feral cat, and you work with it patiently, its kittens will be dramatically easier to socialize than their parent was. And their kittens will be even easier. That's because cats are domesticated. The genetic framework for human compatibility is already there, even in feral populations. Now, you might be wondering about zebras. I mentioned them earlier, and this is where the distinction gets really interesting. Zebras have been captured and trained to pull carts. There are photos from the early 1900s of zebras in harnesses. There was even a famous British zoologist named Lord Rothschild who rode around London in a carriage pulled by 4 zebras just to prove it could be done. So were those zebras domesticated? Absolutely not. They were individually tamed through enormous effort, and even then they remained dangerous and unpredictable. Zebra handlers today will tell you they're the most dangerous animals in many zoos. Every baby zebra born, even from these tamed parents, is just as wild as any zebra on the African savanna. Compare that to horses. We've created over 300 distinct horse breeds. We have horses the size of large dogs and horses that weigh over a ton. We have horses specifically bred for speed, for strength, for temperament, for color, for gait. That's domestication. That's genetic change across populations. Here's where it gets even more fascinating. True domestication actually changes the physical structure of animals' brains. Domestic animals have brains that are 10 to 30% smaller than their wild ancestors. The areas that shrink the most are those associated with fear, aggression, and independence. It's not that domestic animals are stupider. They've just reallocated their brain resources towards skills that help them live with humans. A wolf has to remember every danger, every hunting opportunity, every territorial boundary. A dog has to remember where you keep the treats and what that specific tone in your voice means. Different priorities, different brain structure. Ancient Egyptians have tried to tame cheetahs for over 5,000 years. Sumerian kings had them. Mughal emperors had thousands of them. And in all that time, across all those thousands of cheetahs, do you know how many successfully bred in captivity before the modern era? 0, not 1. Every single cheetah had to be captured from the wild. That's not domestication. That's just a 5,000-year-long failure to domesticate. You can actually see this process happening right now with urban foxes in Britain and Russia. The foxes that can tolerate city life are starting to show subtle changes. Slightly shorter muzzles, different coat patterns, less fear of humans. But they're not domesticated yet. They're just adapted. Their offspring are still wild foxes that happen to live in cities. True domestication would mean those foxes undergo genetic changes that make them seek out human companionship, not just tolerate it. It would mean their babies are born expecting to live with humans, not just capable of it. This distinction is so important because it explains why we can't just domesticate any animal we want. You can't just grab a group of raccoons, breed the friendliest ones, and expect to have domestic raccoons in a few generations. It doesn't work that way. The animal needs to have the genetic potential for domestication already built into its DNA, waiting to be unlocked. And as we're about to see, that genetic potential is ridiculously, almost impossibly rare. So now we get to the really fascinating part. Why can't we just domesticate any animal we want? I mean, we've got the technology, we've got the knowledge, we've even decoded entire genomes. But it turns out there's this incredibly specific checklist that nature has that most animals just can't pass. Back in the 1990s, a scientist named Jared Diamond figured out something brilliant. He identified 6 requirements that an animal absolutely must have to be domesticated. And here's the kicker. If an animal fails even one of these requirements, just one, domestication becomes impossible. Diamond called this the Anna Karenina principle, after that famous line about how happy families are all alike, but every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Domesticable animals all succeed for the same reasons. Every undomesticable animal fails in its own unique way. Let's go through these requirements one by one, and you'll start to see why your dream of having a pet zebra is never going to happen. First requirement, the animal needs to have a flexible diet. This sounds simple, but it eliminates a huge number of species right off the bat. Think about it. If you're going to keep thousands of animals, you need to be able to feed them something that's readily available and economical. Cows? They'll eat grass, hay, grain, pretty much any plant matter you throw at them. Pigs? They're basically garbage disposals. They'll eat literally almost anything. But now think about a koala. It only eats eucalyptus leaves. Not just any eucalyptus either, specific species of eucalyptus. And not just the leaves, but only the young, tender leaves from the tips of branches. You literally cannot domesticate an animal if you can't afford to feed it. This is why we've never domesticated any large carnivores. Can you imagine trying to raise lions for meat? You'd have to raise an entire herd of antelope just to feed your lions, and then, what's the point? You're losing massive amounts of energy at every step of the food chain. Second requirement, the animals need to grow up fast. This one knocked out elephants immediately, which takes 15 to 20 years to reach full maturity. Compare that to a pig, which reaches slaughter weight in 6 months, or a chicken, which starts laying eggs at 5 months. If you're a farmer trying to build up a herd, you can't wait 2 decades for your animals to start reproducing. Third requirement, and this is a big one, the animal has to be willing to breed in captivity. You'd think this would be easy, right? Just put a male and female together and let nature take its course. But for many animals, it's not that simple. They need specific conditions, specific triggers, specific environments to get in the mood. Cheetahs are the poster child for this problem. It wasn't until the 1950s that we figured out why. Cheetahs need to engage in elaborate courtship chases. The female needs to run at full speed with multiple males chasing her over long distances. This triggers ovulation. Without that high-speed chase, which requires miles of open space, female cheetahs simply don't go into heat. You can't replicate that in a farm enclosure. Even modern zoos with all their knowledge and technology have terrible success rates breeding cheetahs. Giant pandas have similar issues. Female pandas are only fertile for 2 to 3 days per year. That's it. Miss that window, and you wait another whole year. And during those few days, they're incredibly picky about their mates. In the wild, females will assess multiple males before choosing. In captivity, if she doesn't like the male you've chosen for her, too bad, no baby pandas this year. Fourth requirement, the animal needs to have a naturally calm disposition. This eliminates way more species than you might think. We're not just talking about obviously aggressive animals like bears or big cats. We're talking about animals that might seem peaceful but have nasty temperaments when you try to work with them. Zebras are the perfect example here. They look just like horses, right? Horses with stripes. Should be easy to domesticate. Except zebras are mean. Not just a little aggressive, they're genuinely vicious. They've been known to bite and hold on to their victims until the person literally dies. African buffalo are another species that looks like it should be domesticable. After all, we domesticated water buffalo in Asia. But African buffalo, also called Cape buffalo, have such aggressive temperaments that they're considered one of the most dangerous animals in Africa. Fifth requirement, the animal can't be too prone to panic. You need animals that stay relatively calm under pressure. Sheep are actually pretty panicky, but they huddle together when scared, which makes them manageable. But truly panicky animals? Impossible. Deer are a great example. You might think, hey, deer are everywhere, they're the right size, they eat plants, perfect for domestication, right? Wrong. Deer are incredibly high-strung. When they panic, which is often, they literally run themselves to death. They'll smash into fences at full speed, breaking their necks. They'll give themselves heart attacks from stress. There's actually a condition called capture myopathy, where wild animals' muscles start breaking down from panic, and they die within hours or days. Deer are especially susceptible to this. Gazelles are even worse. They're so nervous that they can die just from the stress of seeing a human nearby. They have hair trigger reflexes and can jump 10 feet straight up when startled. Imagine trying to keep a herd of animals that could literally leap over any fence you build and might drop dead from anxiety at any moment. Sixth and final requirement, the animal needs to have a social hierarchy that humans can insert themselves into. Almost all domesticated animals naturally live in groups with clear dominance hierarchies. Horses have a lead mare, cattle have a dominance order, dogs have pack leaders. When we domesticate these animals, we essentially insert ourselves at the top of their social structure. But solitary animals? They don't have a social structure for us to hijack. Bears are mostly solitary. Cats are the weird exception that proves the rule. They're barely domesticated and certainly don't see us as their leaders. More like roommates they tolerate. And then there are animals with the wrong kind of social structure. Many antelope species live in groups, but the males fight constantly for dominance. They never really settle into a stable hierarchy. You can't insert yourself as the leader when the animals are constantly challenging each other with potentially lethal combat. Bighorn sheep are similar. The males spend much of their time in violent headbutting contests. These aren't play fights. They can cause serious brain damage. Moose bulls become so aggressive during mating season that they'll attack anything, including trees, cars, and buildings. You cannot safely manage animals that unpredictably switch into murder mode. So when you add all these requirements together, you've got an incredibly narrow filter. The animal needs to eat cheap food, grow up quickly, breed easily in captivity, have a calm disposition, not panic easily, and accept humans as social superiors. How many animals check all 6 boxes? This is why, despite all our modern technology and knowledge, we haven't added a single large mammal to our domestic roster in the last 1,000 years. It's not that we haven't tried. It's that the biological requirements are so specific, so demanding, that nearly every species on Earth fails at least one of them. Now, you might be thinking, okay, these requirements make sense, but surely with enough effort, we could overcome them, right? Well, let me tell you about some of the spectacular failures throughout history that prove nature's constraints are absolutely non-negotiable. Let's start with one of the most ambitious attempts ever, the Swedish moose cavalry. Yes, you heard that right. Moose cavalry. In the 1700s, King Carl the Joint of Sweden had this brilliant idea. Moose are bigger than horses, they're native to Sweden, they can handle the cold better. And imagine the psychological impact of an army riding into battle on these massive antlered beasts. The enemy would flee in terror. So they tried it. They really, really tried. And it failed spectacularly. First problem, moose are incredibly smart, but not in a helpful way. They figured out pretty quickly that battlefields were dangerous places where other moose died. And unlike horses, which can be trained to overcome their fear, moose just refused. They would not go near any area where another moose had been killed. They somehow remembered and avoided these places for years. But the real deal breaker came during mating season. Bull moose in rut become absolutely insane. We're talking about a 1,000-pound animal with giant antlers suddenly deciding that everything is an enemy that must be destroyed. Trees, buildings, other moose, humans, especially humans. The Swedish cavalry officers quickly realized that having their mounts turn into homicidal maniacs for 2 months every year was not exactly compatible with military discipline. The Russians actually picked up where the Swedes left off. Under Stalin, they established the Kostroma moose farm, thinking they could use moose for military transport in Siberia. This farm still exists today, and you know what they use the moose for? Milk. That's it. After decades of trying, they gave up on riding them or using them for work. These moose are essentially just weird cows that produce very expensive milk for tourists. They're still wild animals that happen to tolerate humans, not domesticated creatures. But perhaps the most dramatic failure involves an animal you'd never expect, the great white shark. Now I know what you're thinking. Who in their right mind would try to domesticate a great white shark? Well, nobody was trying to domesticate them, but aquariums spent decades trying to simply keep them in captivity. If we can't even keep an animal alive in a tank, we definitely can't domesticate it. The Monterey Bay Aquarium tried 6 times between 2004 and 2011. 6 times. They had unlimited budgets, the best marine biologists in the world, perfect water conditions, all the fish a shark could eat. The longest a great white survived? 198 days. Most died within hours or days. These sharks would refuse to eat, even when surrounded by their favorite prey. They'd swim into the walls repeatedly, injuring themselves. One shark was released after just 11 days because it killed 2 other sharks in the tank and was ramming the walls so violently that staff feared it would die. These animals are so fundamentally incompatible with captivity that they essentially commit suicide rather than live in confinement. Then there's the hippopotamus, which shows us what happens when people ignore all the warning signs. Throughout history, various rulers and wealthy individuals have tried to keep hippos as pets or working animals. The ancient Egyptians tried it, Roman emperors tried it, and it always ends the same way, badly. The most recent famous case was a South African farmer named Marius Els. He rescued a baby hippo during a flood and raised it from infancy. He named it Humphrey. For 6 years, Els insisted that Humphrey was domesticated, that they had a special bond, that the hippo was like a son to him. He would ride on Humphrey's back and swim with him. He'd post videos online saying, "Humphrey's like a son to me, he's just a lovable giant." In 2011, Humphrey killed him, dragged him into the river and mauled him to death. Because here's the thing about hippos. They're one of the most dangerous animals in Africa. They kill more people annually than lions, leopards, and crocodiles combined. They're incredibly territorial, unbelievably strong, and have a bite force of 1,800 pounds per square inch. That's enough to snap a canoe in half. But Els thought he had domesticated Humphrey. He hadn't. He had a tamed hippo, and there's a massive difference. Taming is just conditioning an individual animal to tolerate your presence. The second that hippo felt territorial or threatened or just grumpy, all that taming meant nothing. Its wild instincts took over instantly. This pattern repeats throughout history. The Carthaginians tried to domesticate African elephants for war. Failed? They could only tame individual elephants captured as babies. The Romans tried to domesticate cheetahs for arena games. Failed? The cheetahs either refused to hunt or became so stressed they died. The Egyptians tried to domesticate hyenas. Failed spectacularly. Even hand-raised hyenas would randomly attack their handlers. More recently, Soviet scientists tried to domesticate the eland, a type of large African antelope. On paper, it looked perfect. Elands produce milk. They're the size of cattle. They can survive in harsh climates. But after decades of attempts, the program failed. The animals remained too flighty, too prone to panic, and could jump over any fence the Soviets built. Even with animals we successfully domesticated thousands of years ago, when we try to domesticate their wild relatives, we fail. We have domestic pigs, but European attempts to domesticate wild boars in modern times have failed. We have dogs, but nobody successfully domesticated wolves despite numerous attempts. The window for domestication seems to be incredibly narrow, and once a species has adapted to either pure wildness or pure domestication, you can't just flip the switch. These failures teach us something profound. Domestication isn't just about training or taming or even selective breeding. It requires a species to have the latent genetic potential for domestication already built into its DNA, and most species simply don't have it. No amount of human effort, technology, or time can overcome these fundamental biological constraints. Okay, so we've talked about all these failures, but here's where things get really wild. In 1959, a Russian scientist basically cracked the code of domestication, and he did it in the most unlikely place, Soviet Siberia, with silver foxes, in secret because Stalin's government thought genetics was bourgeois propaganda. His name was Dmitry Belyaev, and he had this radical idea. What if all those weird traits we see in domestic animals, the floppy ears, the curly tails, the white patches, what if they're not separate things we selected for? What if they all come automatically when you select for just one thing? Tameness. To test this, Belyaev started with 130 silver foxes from a fur farm. Now, these weren't wild foxes, that's important to remember. They'd been on fur farms since the 1800s, but they were still pretty aggressive. They'd bite, they'd try to escape, they basically acted like wild animals that happened to be in cages. Belyaev's team had a simple selection criterion. They'd approach a fox cage and try to touch or hand feed the fox. The foxes that bit, fled, or showed aggression. They didn't breed. Only the calmest 10% of foxes in each generation got to have babies. That's it. No selection for physical traits, no choosing foxes with slightly floppier ears or cuter faces, just tameness. What happened next shocked everyone, including Belyaev. By the fourth generation, some fox pups were wagging their tails when humans approached. Let that sink in. Foxes don't wag their tails in the wild. Ever. It's not a fox behavior, but these foxes were doing it spontaneously. By generation 6, the foxes were not just tolerating humans, but actively seeking attention. They'd whine and whimper for human contact like puppies. But here's where it gets crazy. By generation 10, physical changes started appearing. The foxes developed white patches on their faces. Their tails started curling, their ears became floppy, their snouts got shorter, their skulls changed shape. Some developed blue eyes. These foxes were starting to look like dogs, and nobody was selecting for any of these physical traits. By generation 15, the changes were even more dramatic. The foxes' stress hormone levels had dropped by half. Their adrenal glands, which produce fight-or-flight hormones, had physically shrunk. Their breeding season, which in wild foxes happens once a year, extended to twice a year, just like dogs. After 35 generations, Belyaev's successor, Lyudmila Trut, tested something remarkable. These foxes could understand human gestures. If you pointed at something, the fox would look where you were pointing. That might not sound impressive, but wolves can't do this. Chimpanzees, our closest relatives, can barely do this. But these foxes, selected only for tameness, had developed this incredibly sophisticated social communication with humans. By generation 50, the experiment had produced foxes that were essentially dog-like in their behavior. They'd fetch balls, come when called, and could be house-trained. Today, after more than 60 generations, these foxes are so tame that some are sold as pets, though at about $8,000 each. But Belyaev did something else brilliant. He ran a parallel experiment selecting foxes for aggression instead of tameness. These foxes became incredibly hostile, more aggressive than wild foxes. But here's the fascinating part. They didn't develop the opposite physical features. They didn't get pointier ears or straighter tails. They just stayed looking like regular foxes, just meaner. This proved that the physical changes were specifically linked to selection for tameness, not just to strong selection in general. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, didn't you say these foxes weren't truly wild to begin with? And you're right. In 2019, researchers dropped a bit of a bombshell. They dug into the history and found that the original foxes came from Canadian fur farms that had been breeding foxes since 1894. These foxes might have already been partially domesticated. This discovery led to some heated debates. Did Belyaev really recreate domestication, or did he just finish a process that was already started? Some of those dog-like traits might have already existed at low frequencies in the fur farm population. But here's the thing. Even if the experiment didn't start from scratch, it still showed us something incredible. It proved that selecting for behavior alone could trigger a cascade of physical changes. It showed that domestication syndrome, all those weird traits domestic animals share, isn't a coincidence. There's a biological mechanism linking tameness to floppy ears, and Belyaev found it. The mechanism, as we now understand it, involves something called neural crest cells. When you select for tameness, you're selecting for animals with reduced adrenal glands and lower stress hormones. But adrenal glands develop from neural crest cells, the same cells that create ear cartilage, pigment cells, and parts of the skull. So when you change the development of these cells to reduce fear, you accidentally change all these other features too. It's like pulling one thread and having the whole sweater change color. Evolution tied all these traits together, and Belyaev's foxes proved it. The experiment is still running today, over 60 years later. Scientists are now sequencing the foxes' genomes, identifying the exact genes that changed. They've found mutations in genes like SORCS1, which affects neuron development, and genes that regulate glutamate signaling in the brain. But perhaps the most profound discovery is this. It only took about 50 generations to go from wild-acting foxes to something dog-like. In evolutionary terms, that's a blink of an eye. If domestication can happen that fast under the right conditions, it explains how our ancestors could have domesticated wolves into dogs or wild boars into pigs within a few human lifetimes. The fox experiment changed everything we thought we knew about domestication. It showed us that domestication isn't about controlling every trait. It's about pulling the right genetic lever, tameness, and letting biology do the rest. So you might be wondering, if we now understand exactly how domestication works thanks to experiments like Belyaev's foxes, why aren't we domesticating new animals all the time? We've got CRISPR, we can edit genes, we understand the neural crest cell mechanism. What's stopping us from having pet tigers or domesticated bears? The answer is brutally simple: money and time. But mostly, money. Let me break down the economics of creating a new domesticated species in the modern world, and you'll see why nobody's really trying anymore. First, let's talk about the generational requirement. Belyaev's foxes took 50 generations to become truly dog-like. 50. Now, foxes breed relatively quickly. They can reproduce at 1 year old, so 50 generations is about 50 years. But what if you wanted to domesticate something like an elephant? They don't breed until they're 15 to 20 years old. 50 generations would take literally 1,000 years. Even with faster breeding animals, you're looking at a minimum investment of several decades. Imagine going to investors and saying, "Hey, I need funding for a project that won't show real results until 2074. Good luck with that pitch. But it's not just the time, it's the cost during all that time. Belyaev's fox experiment has required continuous funding for over 60 years. They've had to maintain hundreds of foxes, provide food, veterinary care, housing, and pay staff to work with dangerous, semi-wild animals. The current estimate is that the program has cost tens of millions of dollars over its lifetime. And that's for foxes, which are relatively small and cheap to feed. Want to domesticate something bigger? The costs explode exponentially. A single elephant eats 300 pounds of food per day. Multiply that by hundreds of elephants over multiple generations, and you're looking at costs that would make a billionaire cry. Then there's the regulatory nightmare. Let me tell you about the Aquadvantage salmon, because this perfectly illustrates the problem. This is a genetically modified Atlantic salmon that grows twice as fast as normal salmon. Scientists created it in 1989. It took until 2015 for FDA approval in the United States. 26 years. And that's for a fish that's basically identical to regular salmon, except it grows faster. The company spent over $100 million just on the regulatory approval process. Not on developing the fish, just on proving it was safe. They had to conduct environmental impact studies, food safety assessments, allergen testing, and produce literally tons of paperwork. And this is for an animal we already eat millions of. Now imagine trying to get approval for a newly domesticated carnivore. "Hey, FDA, we've got these semi-domesticated wolves we'd like to sell as pets. They're only slightly more likely to eat your children than regular dogs." That approval process would take decades and cost hundreds of millions if it ever got approved at all. But here's the real killer for new domestication projects. Existing domestic animals already fill every niche we need. Need meat? We've got cows, pigs, chickens, sheep, goats. Need milk? Cows, goats, sheep have you covered. Need eggs? Chickens and ducks. Transportation? Horses, donkeys, camels. Companionship? Dogs and cats. Wool? Sheep, alpacas, llamas. Every ecological and economic niche that a domestic animal could fill is already occupied by species we've optimized for thousands of years. A cow today produces 10 times more milk than a cow from the 1960s. Modern broiler chickens grow 3 times faster than chickens from the 1950s. We've pushed our existing domestic animals to incredible extremes of productivity. So if you wanted to domesticate, say, deer for meat production, you're competing against cattle that have been optimized for 10,000 years. Your deer would need to be spectacularly better to justify the switch, and they're not. They're actually worse in almost every way. They produce less meat, they're harder to contain, they're more disease-prone in captivity. Let me give you a modern example that shows just how impossible the economics are. There's a company in Russia that's been trying to commercialize Belyaev's domesticated foxes. These are foxes that are already domesticated, remember? The work is done. They just need to breed and sell them. A single fox costs $8,000. $8,000? You can get a purebred dog from champion bloodlines for a quarter of that price. And the fox, even domesticated, still smells musky, can't be fully house-trained, and requires special permits in most places. The market for $8,000 semi-smelly pets that might be illegal in your state? Basically non-existent. Then there's the opportunity cost problem. Any company or government that could afford a domestication program could make way more money doing literally anything else. The same $100 million you'd spend domesticating a new species could develop a new pharmaceutical drug, build a tech startup, or just improve existing livestock. The return on investment for domestication is essentially zero for the first several decades, then maybe slightly positive if you're lucky. The only scenarios where new domestication might make economic sense are incredibly specific. Maybe climate change makes traditional livestock impossible in some regions. Maybe we need animals for Mars colonies. Maybe a pandemic wipes out all cattle. But barring these catastrophes, there's just no economic case for it. Even with genetic engineering potentially speeding things up, the costs remain prohibitive. CRISPR might let you skip some generations, but you still need to test the animals, breed them, ensure the traits are stable, get regulatory approval. And the public is already skeptical of GMO corn. Imagine trying to sell them GMO pets. This is why the last major domestication was the lab mouse in the early 1900s, and that only happened because we desperately needed a standardized animal for medical research. The economic incentive was massive. Better medical testing could save human lives and make billions for pharmaceutical companies. For any other species, the math just doesn't work. Domestication in the modern world isn't limited by biology or technology. It's limited by the cold, hard reality that it costs too much, takes too long, and nobody really needs it anyway. Now, here's something that might blow your mind. The animals that got domesticated weren't just about biology or economics. It was also about being in the right place at the right time and having the right cultural attitude toward animals. Geography and culture played a massive role in determining which species ended up as our partners and which remained wild. Let's start with a striking fact. Of the 14 large mammals we've domesticated, 13 came from Europe and Asia. 13. The entire rest of the world, Africa, the Americas, Australia, contributed just one, the llama and alpaca from South America, which are basically the same species. How is that possible? It's not that other continents didn't have animals, it's that geography created dramatically different opportunities. Eurasia is basically one giant horizontal landmass stretching from Spain to China. Same latitudes mean similar climates, similar day lengths, similar seasons. An animal domesticated in Turkey could thrive in France or China without much adaptation. A cow that works at 40 degrees north latitude in Spain will work at 40 degrees north latitude in Japan. But look at the Americas. It's vertical, stretching from the Arctic to Antarctica. You've got every climate zone imaginable, separated by massive geographic barriers. The animals that thrive in the Amazon rainforest can't survive in the Mexican desert. The creatures adapted to the Andes can't live in the Great Plains. Even if Native Americans in Peru domesticated an amazing animal, good luck getting it to spread to North America. It would have to cross the Darien Gap, multiple climate zones, and completely different ecosystems. This geographic difference had devastating consequences. When the Pleistocene era ended about 12,000 years ago, the Americas lost almost all their large mammals. We're talking about American horses, camels, giant ground sloths, mastodons, all gone. Scientists still debate why, but the result was clear. Native Americans had way fewer domestication candidates to work with. Actually, let me tell you about those American horses because it's mind-blowing. Horses evolved in North America. They spread to Asia across the Bering Land Bridge, then went extinct in the Americas about 10,000 years ago. So Native Americans saw horses disappear. Then thousands of years later, Spanish conquistadors showed up riding the descendants of those same horses. Imagine if aliens landed tomorrow riding domesticated dinosaurs. That's basically what it was like. But geography isn't just about animal distribution. It's also about human population density and interaction. Eurasia had multiple centers of civilization in constant contact. Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, China. Ideas, technologies, and animals could spread between them. When someone in the Fertile Crescent domesticated sheep, that knowledge and those animals could spread across the entire continent. Africa, despite being connected to Eurasia, had the Sahara Desert as a massive barrier. Sub-Saharan Africa was largely isolated from the domestication innovations happening in Eurasia. Plus, African animals evolved alongside humans for millions of years, making them warier and harder to domesticate. Remember those zebras we talked about? They're so suspicious of humans because they co-evolved with us. Eurasian horses didn't have that same evolutionary arms race. Now let's talk about culture, because this is where things get really interesting. Different societies had completely different relationships with animals, and these attitudes determined what got domesticated and how. Take cats in ancient Egypt. Egyptians didn't just domesticate cats. They worshipped them. The goddess Bastet had a cat's head. Killing a cat was punishable by death. When a pet cat died, the entire family would shave their eyebrows in mourning. This religious reverence accelerated cat domestication and spread cats throughout the Mediterranean world. Without Egyptian cat worship, we might not have domestic cats today. On the flip side, cultural taboos prevented some domestications. Hinduism considers cows sacred. You can't eat them, you can't hurt them, they're literally holy. This meant that while Europeans were breeding cattle for meat production, Indians were selecting for completely different traits: milk production, docility, heat tolerance. That's why zebu cattle from India look and act so different from European cattle. Same species, completely different cultural selection pressures. Islam and Judaism prohibit eating pork, calling pigs unclean. This meant huge regions of the Middle East and North Africa had no incentive to improve pig breeds. Meanwhile, in China, pork is the primary meat, and they developed dozens of specialized pig breeds. Chinese cultures actually measure wealth in pigs. The Chinese character for home is literally a roof over a pig. Some cultures just had different ideas about what animals were for. Many Native American tribes viewed animals as spiritual equals, not resources to be owned. The Lakota believed buffalo were their relatives. You don't domesticate your relatives. This philosophical stance, while admirable, meant they never attempted systematic domestication of buffalo, even though buffalo are closely related to cattle. The Aztecs are fascinating because they actually did domesticate some unusual animals, just not for the reasons you'd expect. They domesticated turkeys, obviously, but also bees for honey, and they semi-domesticated deer. But here's the weird part. They were one of the only cultures to domesticate insects for dye. The cochineal insect, which lives on cacti and produces bright red dye, was more valuable than gold to the Aztecs. Climate and geography also determined which domestications were even worth attempting. Reindeer domestication only happened in the Arctic because that's the only place where it made sense. Why would someone in tropical India bother domesticating an animal that needs snow to survive? Similarly, water buffalo domestication happened in tropical Asia, where their love of wallowing in mud was actually beneficial for rice paddy cultivation. The Arabs domesticated camels because they lived in deserts where camels' ability to go weeks without water was invaluable. But Vikings in Scandinavia had no use for camels. They tried to domesticate moose instead, which, as we discussed, failed spectacularly. Australia is perhaps the most extreme example. Indigenous Australians never domesticated any animals except the dingo, which was already semi-domesticated when it arrived. Why? Australia's native mammals are marsupials with completely different biology from placental mammals. Kangaroos, wombats, koalas, they're all weird by mammalian standards. Plus, Aboriginal Australian culture emphasized living with the land rather than controlling it. They had no agricultural tradition that would drive animal domestication. The result of all these geographic and cultural factors is that animal domestication was incredibly patchy and uneven. It wasn't survival of the fittest. It was survival of the most conveniently located and culturally acceptable. Alright, so we've talked about Belyaev's foxes and how selecting for tameness creates all these physical changes. But here's what's really mind-blowing. Modern genetic research has shown us exactly what's happening inside these animals' DNA, and it's way weirder and more complex than anyone imagined. First, let's talk about what domestication actually does to an animal's brain. This is going to sound crazy, but domestic animals have smaller brains than their wild ancestors. Dogs' brains are about 15 to 20% smaller than wolves' brains. Domestic pigs? Their brains are 35% smaller than wild boars. 35%? That's more than a third of their brain just gone. Now, before you start thinking your dog is stupid, that's not what's happening. The brain shrinkage isn't random. Specific parts shrink more than others. The areas that shrink the most are the ones dealing with fear, aggression, and environmental awareness. The amygdala, which processes fear and aggression, is significantly reduced. The areas that help animals map territory and track threats? Also smaller. But here's the fascinating part. The areas involved in social bonding and reading social cues? Those actually get enhanced. It's not that domestic animals are dumber. They've reallocated their brain resources. A wolf needs to remember every rustle in the forest that might be danger. Your dog needs to remember that when you pick up the leash, it means walk time. Now let's dive into the actual genetics, because this is where things get absolutely wild. Remember the neural crest cell hypothesis I mentioned earlier? Scientists have now identified the specific genes involved, and it's like finding the user manual for domestication. There's a gene called BAZ1B. Humans with Williams-Beuren syndrome, who are extremely friendly and trusting, have mutations in this gene. Guess what? Domestic dogs have similar mutations in BAZ1B compared to wolves. This single gene affects neural crest cell migration, and changing it makes animals friendlier, while also giving them those characteristic domestic features. But it's not just one gene. Modern genomic studies have identified over 40 genes that consistently change during domestication across different species. These same genes pop up whether you're looking at dogs versus wolves, pigs versus boars, or even domesticated fish versus wild fish. Evolution found a recipe for domestication and uses it over and over. Here's where it gets even crazier: epigenetics. This is stuff that affects how genes work without changing the DNA sequence itself. Think of DNA as a recipe book, and epigenetics as sticky notes that say, skip this step, or do this part twice. Domestication changes these sticky notes in massive ways. Scientists studied methylation patterns, one type of epigenetic modification, in dogs and wolves. They found over 68,000 regions where the methylation was different. These changes affect how stress response genes work, how the brain develops, even how the immune system functions. And here's the kicker. Some of these epigenetic changes can be inherited. The experiences of one generation can literally change how genes work in the next generation. This might explain something weird about domestication, why it seems to have momentum. Once you start selecting for tameness, the changes accelerate. The first few generations change slowly, but then things speed up dramatically. It's possible that epigenetic changes are priming the genome for further domestication, making each generation more responsive to selection. Let's talk about one specific discovery that absolutely shocked geneticists. There's something called the domestication syndrome, where all these different traits, floppy ears, curly tails, white patches, appear together. Scientists used to think these were all controlled by different genes that somehow got selected together. Nope. They're linked by developmental pathways. When neural crest cells don't migrate properly, it affects melanocytes, the cells that produce pigment. That's why you get white patches. The same cells form ear cartilage, so disrupted migration means floppy ears. They also contribute to adrenal gland development, so you get reduced stress hormones. One developmental change, multiple effects. It's like pulling one thread and having the entire fabric change pattern. The genetics also explain why you can't domesticate just any animal. Some species literally don't have the genetic variation necessary for domestication. Cheetahs, for example, went through a genetic bottleneck about 10,000 years ago. All cheetahs today are so genetically similar, they can accept skin grafts from any other cheetah. They're almost clones. Without genetic variation, there's nothing for selection to work on. But here's my favorite discovery. Scientists found that domestic animals have changes in genes related to neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. These are the chemicals that affect mood and behavior. Domestic animals literally have different brain chemistry than their wild relatives. They're not just acting tamer, their brains are fundamentally wired for calmness and social bonding. They've even identified specific mutations that create behavioral changes. There's a gene called QMT that breaks down dopamine. Dogs have mutations that make this gene less active, meaning dopamine stays in their brains longer. Dopamine is associated with reward-seeking and social bonding. Your dog isn't just pretending to love you for food, its brain chemistry is literally altered to enhance bonding. And remember those white patches that appear in domestic animals? They're caused by mutations in a gene called KIT. But KIT doesn't just affect color, it also influences behavior, stress response, and even metabolism. This one gene connects physical appearance to behavior in ways we're just beginning to understand. The research has also revealed that domestication isn't a one-way street. There's something called fertilization, where domestic animals return to the wild and some of these changes reverse. But interestingly, they never fully go back. Feral pigs grow bigger and hairier than domestic pigs, but they don't become identical to wild boars. The genetic changes of domestication leave permanent marks. Modern techniques like CRISPR are starting to let us test these genetic theories directly. Scientists can now take a specific domestication mutation from dogs and put it into wolf cells in a petri dish to see what happens. They can knock out domestication genes in mice to see if they become more wild-like. We're literally reverse engineering domestication in real time. All this genetic research has revealed something profound. Domestication isn't just about taming or training. It's a fundamental rewiring of an animal's genome, brain structure, and biochemistry. We're not just teaching animals to live with us, we're literally transforming them at the molecular level. So where does all this leave us? We understand the genetics, we've got CRISPR, we can literally edit DNA like a Word document. Are we about to enter a new age of domestication where we can finally have those pet tigers and rideable zebras? Well, not exactly. But what's actually happening is way more interesting and kind of weird. Let's start with what's actually working right now. The biggest success story isn't with fuzzy mammals, it's with fish. Aquadvantage salmon, which I mentioned earlier, grow twice as fast as normal salmon thanks to a growth hormone gene from Chinook salmon and a promoter sequence from ocean pout. These fish reach market size in 18 months instead of 3 years. That's actual domestication acceleration happening right now. But here's the thing. It took 30 years and $100 million to get these salmon approved, and people are still freaked out about eating them. They're sold in Canada and the US, but they have to be labeled as genetically modified, and most consumers avoid them. So even when the technology works, the social acceptance isn't there. Scientists are having more luck with animals people don't get emotional about. Mosquitoes, for instance. There's a company called Oxitec that's created genetically modified mosquitoes whose offspring die before reaching adulthood. Release these into the wild, and mosquito populations crash. It's not domestication exactly, but it's humans genetically controlling wild animal populations. They've already released billions of these mosquitoes in Brazil, the Cayman Islands, and Florida. Now, the really ambitious stuff is happening with de-extinction projects. There's a company called Colossal Biosciences that's raised over $15 million to bring back the woolly mammoth. Well, sort of. They're not actually bringing back mammoths. They're taking Asian elephants and using CRISPR to edit their genes to be more mammoth-like, adding genes for thick hair, cold-adapted blood, and layers of fat. The crazy part? They've already made 45 genetic edits. They're literally creating a cold-resistant elephant that could theoretically survive in Siberia. The plan is to release these neo-mammoths into the Arctic to help restore grasslands and fight climate change. Whether that's brilliant or insane is still up for debate. But here's what's really interesting about these de-extinction projects. They're essentially domestication in reverse. Instead of taking wild animals and making them more suitable for human environments, we're taking domestic or endangered animals and making them more wild. The same company is trying to bring back the Tasmanian tiger and the dodo. It's domestication technology being used for rewilding. There's also the Toros project in Europe, which is trying to recreate the aurochs, the wild ancestor of cattle that went extinct in 1627. But they're not using genetic engineering. They're using selective breeding of existing cattle breeds that still carry aurochs genes. They've already created cattle that look remarkably like aurochs. Huge, aggressive, with forward-facing horns. It's like running domestication in reverse using traditional methods. But let's be real about what's actually likely to be domesticated in the future. It's not going to be tigers or bears. It's going to be insects. Black soldier flies are already being farmed at massive scales. They convert food waste into protein incredibly efficiently. A colony can reduce food waste by 95% in just days. Companies are genetically modifying these flies to grow faster, produce more protein, and even create specific amino acid profiles. Within a decade, most of the animal feed in agriculture might come from genetically modified insects. Crickets are another candidate. They require 2,000 times less water than beef to produce the same amount of protein. Companies are using CRISPR to create crickets that grow larger, reproduce faster, and have reduced chitin in their exoskeletons to make them easier to digest. This isn't sexy domestication of charismatic megafauna, but it might literally save the planet. There's also fascinating work happening with coral. Scientists are using selective breeding and genetic modification to create supercorals that can survive warmer, more acidic oceans. They're essentially domesticating coral to survive climate change. Some researchers are even creating hybrid corals that grow 10 times faster than normal. Imagine domesticated coral reefs that we plant like underwater forests. But here's the reality check. Even with all this technology, we're mostly just tweaking existing domestic species rather than creating new ones. CRISPR can speed up the process, but it can't overcome the fundamental biological barriers we've talked about. Take the zebra problem. Even if we could edit every aggression gene, every panic response, every social behavior gene to match horses exactly, we'd essentially just have created a striped horse. What's the point? We already have horses. The economics still don't make sense. The one area where true new domestication might happen is with microorganisms. Scientists are domesticating bacteria and yeast at incredible rates. There are yeast strains that produce spider silk proteins, bacteria that make insulin, algae that create biofuels. This is domestication, just at a scale we can't see. There's even research into domesticating viruses. Bacteriophages are viruses that kill bacteria. Scientists are modifying them to target antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Imagine domesticated viruses that we release into your body to hunt down infections. It sounds like science fiction, but clinical trials are already happening. The future of domestication isn't going to look like the past. We're not going to suddenly have a bunch of new farm animals or exotic pets. Instead, we're going to have genetically modified insects providing our protein, engineered bacteria producing our medicines, modified coral reefs protecting our coastlines, and maybe, just maybe, woolly mammoths roaming Siberia again. The real breakthrough won't be in domesticating new species, but in precisely engineering the ones we already have. Your grandchildren might have dogs that never get cancer, cats that don't trigger allergies, or chickens that lay eggs containing vaccines. The future of domestication is less about taming wild beasts and more about molecular-level partnership with the organisms already around us. And honestly, that's probably for the best. Do we really want someone's neighbor having a pet bear, even a genetically modified friendly one? Some things are better left wild, no matter how good our technology gets. So after everything we've talked about, the fox experiments, the genetic engineering, the de-extinction projects, you might think humans have basically conquered nature, right? But here's the truth that all this science has actually revealed. We are way less powerful than we think we are. The more we learn about domestication, the more we realize it wasn't really us doing the domesticating. It was evolution using us as a tool. We didn't master these animals. We stumbled into partnerships that evolution had already made possible. We've identified millions of species on Earth. We've been trying to domesticate animals for at least 15,000 years. We have cultures on every continent, in every environment, with every motivation imaginable. And after all that time, all that effort, all those attempts, we've managed to truly domesticate maybe 40 animals total. Not 40,000, not 4,000, 40. That's a success rate of essentially zero. We're not masters of nature. We're just really good at working with the incredibly tiny fraction of species that happen to have the right genetic toolkit for domestication. Even our greatest domestication success story, dogs, wasn't really our achievement. Recent genetic evidence suggests wolves basically domesticated themselves. The friendliest wolves started hanging around human camps, eating our garbage. They selected themselves for tameness because the ones that could tolerate humans got free food. We didn't domesticate wolves into dogs. Wolves domesticated themselves, and we just took credit for it. And here's something that should humble us even more. Despite all our modern technology, we haven't successfully domesticated a single large mammal in the last 1,000 years. Not one. The last major domestication was probably reindeer, and that was at least 2,000 years ago. Since then, with all our scientific advancement, nothing. CRISPR doesn't change this fundamental limitation. Sure, we can edit genes, but only if we know what we're editing and why. The genetic basis of behavior is insanely complex. There isn't a single aggression gene we can just delete. There are hundreds, maybe thousands of genes involved in temperament, and they interact in ways we don't understand. Take the seemingly simple task of making zebras less aggressive. We'd need to identify every gene involved in their aggression, figure out how to modify them without breaking something else, ensure those modifications work together, and then somehow convince the zebra's brain to reorganize itself around these new instructions. The zebra's aggression isn't a bug. It's a feature developed over millions of years of evolution. Every cell in its body, every neural pathway, every hormone system is built around being a wild, aggressive survivor. Even when we try to work with already domesticated animals, we hit walls constantly. We've been breeding dogs for thousands of years, and we still can't eliminate hip dysplasia. We can't stop cats from hunting birds. We can't make chickens that don't establish pecking orders. These behaviors and traits are so deeply embedded in their biology that even intensive selective breeding can't remove them. The Russian fox experiment really drives this home. Even after 60 generations of selecting for tameness, those foxes still aren't dogs. They're dog-like, sure, but they still smell musky. They're harder to house train, and they don't bond with humans the same way dogs do. 60 generations of perfect laboratory conditions, and we still couldn't fully recreate what happened with dogs naturally. And remember, that experiment might have started with foxes that were already partially domesticated. If that's true, then even our best example of controlled domestication is actually just tweaking what nature had already started. Here's another humbling fact. Most of our domestic animals are actually pretty terrible at being domestic. Sheep are so helpless they'll die if they fall on their backs. Modern dairy cows produce so much milk they'd die without human intervention. Bulldogs can barely breathe. Pugs' eyes can pop out of their sockets. We haven't mastered these animals. We've created mutants that can't survive without us. The limits become even clearer when you look at failed attempts with seemingly perfect candidates. Asian elephants have been working with humans for 4,500 years. They're intelligent, social, and capable of complex tasks, but they're still not domesticated. Every generation has to be captured and trained from scratch. 4.5 millennia of trying, and we couldn't crack the code. The same is true for cheetahs. Ancient civilizations tried for thousands of years. They had unlimited resources, no animal welfare concerns, and desperate motivation. Complete failure. The biological requirements for domestication are so specific that even perfect candidates can't be forced into it. Climate change is revealing another limitation. Many domestic species can't adapt to changing conditions without us. Wild animals are migrating, adapting, evolving. Our domestic animals just stand there and suffer. We've made them so dependent that they've lost the ability to respond to environmental changes. That's not mastery. That's creating helpless dependence. Even our successes are limited by what the animals brought to the table. We didn't make cows produce milk. They already did that. We just selected for more. We didn't make chickens lay eggs. We just convinced them to lay more often. We didn't create wool on sheep. We just made it grow longer. Everything useful about domestic animals was already there in their wild ancestors. We just amplified it. And here's the ultimate limitation. Domestication only works because these animals' ancestors already had the genetic potential for it. Somewhere in their DNA was a hidden program for living with humans, waiting to be activated. We didn't write that program. Evolution did millions of years ago, for reasons that had nothing to do with us. The truth is, domestication isn't a human achievement. It's an evolutionary accident that we stumbled into. We're not creators or masters. We're just participants in partnerships that nature made possible. And for 99.99% of species on Earth, that partnership simply isn't an option, no matter what we do. That's not depressing. It's actually amazing. It means the few domestication events that did happen were absolutely extraordinary. Your dog isn't just a pet. It's the result of an incredibly rare evolutionary lottery win. Every domestic animal represents a 1 in a million chance that worked out.